I have a vague remembrance when I was a little boy of Pope Pius XII declaring that Mary was assumed into heaven, body and soul. The doctrine of the Assumption says that at her death, Mary was taken body and soul into heaven. There was a 3-day ceremony at the Vatican for the declaration of this dogma. That gathering of church officials and church people was the largest religious gathering in the history of the world up to that time. There's nothing in the scriptures about the Assumption. We don't know anything about Mary's death. We don't hear anything about her after that first Pentecost. But her assumption into heaven was part of the church's tradition, something that has been spoken about, prayed about, sung about since the 3rd or the 4th century. But then in 1950, this belief of the people for so long, Pope Pius XII formally declared that this is a doctrine that we as Catholic Christians need to believe. Like some other religious doctrines that were proclaimed through the centuries, there's probably something of a political element about the Assumption. In 1950, the world had just completed a decade of World War II, of the Holocaust, of the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and probably part of the reason that Pope Pius XII declared the doctrine of the Assumption was to reaffirm the goodness of creation. So many things had gone wrong in this world, and so now he celebrates that Mary, a human being like us, part of creation, was taken up into heaven to experience the glory of God. We really don't know anything about Mary's death. There's nothing about that in the scriptures. And in the early years of the church, there were discussions, divisions, arguments. Did she really die or not? It's never stated that. It's not a doctrine of faith. Some said she was taken up into heaven while she was still alive. But the overall tradition was that Mary did die and then was assumed into heaven. It isn't really helpful to think about Mary's death, to worry about that too much, to think about how she died and was buried and how her body came up out of the grave and was taken up into heaven. That's not what the Assumption is all about. Rather, the real meaning of the Assumption is that Mary was given the honored role of being the first human being, the first part of God's creation, to share God's glory in heaven. To share that glory in heaven is the destiny for all of us. But Mary was honored to be the first of all people. And she received that honor, first of all, because she was the mother of Jesus and the mother of God, but also too because she was fully obedient to God's will at every stage of her life. Today, the gospel has the story of the visitation. Mary, who was pregnant with Jesus, goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who was pregnant with John the Baptist. And the story recognizes it's a foreshadowing of the role, the special place that Jesus and John would have in God's plan of salvation. But really, all of us have a role in God's plan of salvation. All of us are baptized, and we all share the mission, the ministry of Jesus that is meant to continue. Today, with the Assumption, what we're recognizing is that Mary fulfilled her part in God's plan of salvation so well that today we celebrate she was assumed into heaven as a reward for her role. Even before Jesus was born, Mary was a young woman who stood out because she was so motivated by justice. in the gospel today, we hear Mary proclaim the prayer that we call the Magnificat. And she saw that God was on the side of the poor, and that God would reverse things. The way the world looked at rewarding people who were rich and thinking they were so great, Mary saw that God would lift up the poor and raise them to the highest part of heaven, to the heavenly banquet. And she proclaimed that in the Magnificat. And then she herself played her part in God's plan with great strength and devotion, taking on her role. I don't know if you've thought about it, but her life, once she met the angel Gabriel at the Annunciation, I'm sure was filled with worry, with uncertainty, with anxiety. Can you imagine Mary as a young woman, probably a teenager, and the angel Gabriel comes to her and asks her to be the mother of God? What does that mean? She didn't have a clue, but she was willing, because of her faith, to say yes. And then I imagine she suffered so much and worried so much as Jesus was growing up, and she saw him gradually understanding more and more the role of the Messiah, and coming to realize, that's me, I'm to be the Messiah, and helping him to figure out, what does that mean? And then as he became a young man and started to preach and teach, to see how the Pharisees, the religious leaders, the political leaders were all organized against him and were plotting for his death. And then finally, she walked the way of the cross with him. She stood at the cross while he died. That was Mary's role, and she fulfilled it so well. And throughout all of that, her faith never wavered. She was able to accept God's will. And in doing that, she became the perfect model for all of us as disciples of Jesus. A British theologian and a spiritual writer, a woman named Carol Houselander, spoke about Mary's role. And this is a quote: "The one thing that Mary did and does is the one thing that we all have to do, namely, to bear Christ into the world. Christ must be born from every soul, formed in every life." Mary is honored today, not because of the great graces that she was given, but rather because of the way that she accepted that grace and used it and responded to it. And that's the challenge for all of us, for each of us, to recognize the graces, the opportunities that God gives to us, and to respond to that grace and the very difficult circumstances that we also experience in our lives. And so the question for us today on the Feast of the Assumption, and the challenge for us throughout our lives, how do we respond to the graces God gives to us, as Mary responded to the graces given to her? We ask ourselves today and every day, do we bear Christ into the world?